Continuing the Necromancer curses of Diablo 2, it's time we take a look at the utility curses, Weaken, Iron Maiden, and Lifetap, each of which lacks the control tools of AI curses or the piercing tools of damage augmentation curses, but it still has a place in the arsenal of the Necromancer as well as uses for other class when they can find them. Starting out with the least loved of the bunch, we have Weaken, which actually in 2.4 got an improvement, with the inclusion of a scaling effect with level to allow it to at least attempt to compete with Decrepify, though sadly it's not quite enough to do so. This is because of how it works, basically subtracting from the enhanced damage effects rather than impacting base damage. For example, with level 35 Weaken, we reduce the enemy damage by 67%, which is the 33% from level 1, with 1% per level after added to it. This means for normal enemies with no modifiers, yes, it will reduce their physical attack damage by 67%, but against more dangerous enemies, such as Fanaticism or Might, or even Extra Strong, it is a bit less significant, since it only subtracts from these improvements, which you'd need fairly high level Weaken to overcome. This is further reduced in usefulness thanks to it actually only applying to attacks, so it will not reduce the damage of things such as Stygian Doll Explosion, since they're unaffected by enhanced damage, or in this case, reduced damage effects. So pretty much the main use of this is going to be triggered items for mercenaries on characters that don't generally use or even have access to better curses, such as Decrepify, which will decrease enemy damage by much more due to its slow effect on top of the damage penalty. Next though, we move into the skills you generally will find a use for, starting with the only damage reflection ability that did not get a change in 2.4, Iron Maiden. This curse works much like Thorns in that the damage it reflects is based on the actual damage dealt rather than potential damage, and only deals it based on physical melee damage since it is also only returning physical damage. That said, the elephant in the room is that the curse functions by latching onto an enemy rather than latching onto an ally like Thorns or Spirit of the Barbs, so you cannot use things such as amplified damage with it, since it would override this curse, which can be a bit of pain in the butt since it makes Amplify generally be the better choice if you have access to any other form of retaliatory damage. Now, you may think due to that it becomes fairly useless, though it does serve a role until you can get access to Thorns or even Spirit of the Barbs, since for normal difficulty it will generally be your go-to with a Summoner Necromancer for dealing with Act bosses, since like we explained in the Thorns video, the increased damage Act bosses do to minions carries over into the amount of damage this retaliation deals back, making it a 1-point wonder along with your Clay Golem for cheesing most bosses in normal difficulty, until you can get a Thorns Mercenary in Nightmare, at which point you can switch to Amplify or Decrepify for bosses. And it is worth noting, like a lot of retaliation skills, it has a massive penalty in PvP, though this penalty is only 1/4 rather than 1/8 like Thorns. Now, last up on the list is probably the skill most of you are, well, most aware of and use most frequently, especially if you're running with any paladins farming Ubers, and that is Lifetap, which at first glance to most players probably just seems like a glorified source of life leech, and while to an extent that is right, the skill has some interesting mechanics that make it far more useful than its equipment-bound cousin. As far as how it works, it is best to separate it in your mind from life leech, since Lifetap functions on a physical damage dealt is converted to life gained formula, rather than the more complex formula of Life Leech, which has to pass through difficulty penalties, enemy drain effectiveness, among other concerns. Or simply put, if you can deal physical damage with an attack or ability, you will gain 50% of that back as life with Lifetap. It does not matter whether it's a drain immune skeleton, or if you're using a non-draining skill like Smite, it will just work. This is the reason players will often nab up Lifetap wands for budget Uber farming, and later on use things like Exile or even Last Wish, depending on which they have and which character they're playing, to guarantee this ability is active on enemies. And why you should not override this curse if you see it in the wild, since it is often the tool keeping your tank alive. It can also be pretty handy for keeping your mercenary alive with more budget setups, so keep that in mind as well. Now, should the Necromancer use it a lot by themselves? Generally, no. There's very few reasons for them to, outside of maybe the mercenary or ally reason, and a lot of curses will serve them better, but for the team player, it can be great. The last part is, how many points to invest in it though? I would say it's a 1-point wonder, since the radius and duration are the only things that get improved by additional levels, so your plus skills can make them reach tolerable points, but you don't really need to invest a lot of points to make it good enough. So, do you find these utility curses on your hotbar very often, or do you tend to stick to the big three we have linked on screen now? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the patrons, channel members, and Twitch subs that keep these guides coming.